So this may not look like anything more than a pile of garbage to you. And this here might not look like anything more than a little bit of a messy, I just tripped over something, that's kind of ironic, a messy basement. But let me tell you, this is, for me, a massive victory. See, on Boxing Day, day after Christmas, my brother and I were standing like this, peering down into the main drain in my basement, trying to figure out where some smell was coming from, where some water was coming from, maybe even some other stuff was coming from. And so we were standing like this in our socks when someone upstairs flushed the toilet. And all of a sudden, there was the biggest mess in my basement that I have ever experienced. And so we literally were dancing around in our socks, trying to avoid the sewage that was coming up out of the floor drain. This right here, this is the floor drain. This is the culprit of the mess. Well, actually, it's not the cause of the mess. It's just where we first discovered it. And so for the first time, I'm in my basement and things are a little bit clean and set up, and at least I don't feel like I am under siege from, from sewage. So it's great. But as this was happening, it got me thinking, this one question we all ask: why do bad things happen to good people? Okay, for real, that's not why I was thinking that question, why I was asking that question. Why I was really thinking about it is because we talked about it this past Sunday at church. And the reality is that it's something that we all think about, that we all talk about, probably even without realizing it. So I thought I would talk about a brief story about a moment in my life and in my wife's life that I think about every time I think about this problem or question of pain and suffering. That is, why is there pain and suffering in the world? For many people, it's voiced this way: if you believe in a God who is good, and if you believe in a God who can do what he says he's going to do, and who loves us, then why is there pain and suffering in the world? Why does that God continue to allow evil to exist? And it's a difficult question, and there are many different answers. There are many different reasons why God might allow evil to continue to exist. I want to explore just one today through the lens of this story. About a year ago, just before Christmas, it was Christmas Eve actually, my daughter was not even one. This was her first Christmas. I was getting ready. I was supposed to be preaching at the church where I was working, and I heard screaming. I heard screaming coming from downstairs. I was upstairs, just had jumped in the shower. And at first it sounded like it was just my daughter and she was crying, and then I could also tell that it was my wife yelling. So my daughter was crying and my wife was yelling for me to come downstairs. And so I jumped out of the shower, dried off as quickly as I could, and ran downstairs to find my wife holding our daughter, not even 1 year old yet, and my daughter was covered in blood. There was blood everywhere, all over her hands, all over her face, her sweatshirt, like just everywhere. And my wife also was covered in blood at this point. She had smears of it on her face. And so naturally, I panicked a little bit, and I remember scooping up my daughter and saying, like, what's wrong? Like, trying to figure out what part of her was cut and bleeding. And it turned out she had cut her hand. She cut 3 fingers open. She was just, playing, and it was an accident. It was completely this freak accident. She cut 3 fingers open and looked like she needed stitches. So we rushed her to the doctor. We arrived at the hospital, and one thing, when you arrive at the hospital with a baby in that state, everybody lets you go ahead of them. But so we were rushed in. We saw a doctor. Doctor said, you're going to need stitches. Your daughter's going to need stitches. It's just the way things are. If you want it to heal properly, we're going to have to stitch up her hand. And so they tried. They tried to stitch her hand up. They gave her freezing so that she wouldn't feel it. And then the doctor went to work trying to stitch her little tiny fingers with this tiny little needle and tiny stitching thread. And it didn't work. she wouldn't let him. She kept squeezing her fist closed. She was crying and screaming, and of course she was scared and, I think still probably a little bit in pain and shock. She wasn't sure what was going on and why is this guy poking me with a needle. And so it became pretty clear to the doctor that he was going to need some help. And so he turned to my wife and I, and he said, I'm going to need you to hold her down and hold her hand open so that I can stitch it. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do as a dad so far. I remember my wife bear hugged our daughter and scooped her up in her arms, and then I held her arm down and actually with my one hand just kind of held her hand so that her fingers would stay open and the doctor could stitch her hand up. And I remember her staring up at me and screaming and crying and just this utter look of betrayal on her face. She didn't know why she was going through the pain that she was going through. She didn't know why we were making her endure that type of suffering. And I wonder if God looks at us kind of like how my wife and I were looking at our daughter. We knew what she didn't know. We could see what she couldn't see, and that is that if she wanted her hand to heal properly, she needed the stitches. If she wanted her hand to heal up and she wanted to get full use of it, she needed those stitches. She needed to go through a little bit of pain and suffering in that moment for greater health moving forward. And I wonder if God looks at us and says, to some of our pain and suffering, there's a purpose and a promise in it. There's a purpose to your pain and suffering. That is, it's going to lead to some form or shape of greater life for you. You just can't see it yet. And there's a promise in your pain that God is with you, even though you feel like he's not, even though you feel like he's maybe left you or abandoned or even is involved in causing it. That there's a purpose to it. It's going to lead to greater life. And there's a promise in it that God is always with you.